it going, guys? So as you probably already know, Canon just released a brand new camera called the EOS R. When I first saw that they announced this new camera and I saw the initial design of the body, I was like, hold on, could this be the ultimate video DSLR camera? And then I started looking into it, and Canon has said that it's not a replacement for any of their current DSLR cameras, it's an addition to their lineup. So I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. This is their first actually full frame mirrorless camera, and they've done a little bit of work in the past with the M5, but they were also late to that. So I was like, okay, better late than never to be finally getting into the mirrorless game, and something that we're definitely gonna have to highlight is Sony. It's got a 30.3 megapixel CMOS sensor, which is pretty standard on most of the professional DSLRs. It's got an 8 frame per second burst rate, which doesn't quite make sense to me since the 70 Mark II has a 10 frame per second burst rate and it has a mechanical shutter. You'd think if you go over to a mirrorless camera, you would be able to basically go up as fast as you want. But here's where things go a little south. It can shoot 4K, which is what we've been asking for, but it's at a 1.7 times crop. That's more than the APS-C, which is a 1.6. The 1DX does a 1.2 in 4K. And then to pile on top of that, it's only got one SD card. I don't really know who this camera is for. So at the same time, Canon announced a whole new lineup of lenses called the ER series, which are slightly different from their EF series. This means if you want to use any of your previous lenses on this new guy, you'll have to use an adapter. So it sounds like this new mounting system has a few more prongs for data to transfer from the lens to the camera. So you're supposed to be able to do some more fancy things, but it doesn't really sound like that's gonna happen. I do have to say that Canon has always made some really nice lenses, and these new ones that they just announced have some really low apertures, surprisingly low that they haven't actually made lenses with this low of apertures before, so that's cool to see. But let's focus on the EOS R. So I'm not quite sure where they're going with the naming. I'm assuming if they make further generations, it would be the EOS R Mark II. But what I'd really like to see is they make basically a mirrorless version of the 1DX Mark II, because ever since I got this camera about 6 months ago, this is the best camera that combines amazing photography with really, really good video. The only reason I don't bring this to every single shoot I do is because it's so massive and heavy, especially if you put on a long lens. And then if you try to put this on a gimbal like my Ronin M or the Crane 2, it can balance it, but it definitely is struggling, which is a shame because the video is so amazing. So what I was hoping for is that Canon would make a mirrorless version just to compact everything down. In their initial release video of the EOS R, they talked about how it has slightly less buttons, which means things are gonna be moved around. I'm fine with fewer buttons. So it sounds to me like the EOS R is just a slight step up from the 80D, which is what I'm filming on right now and has been a longtime favorite of mine. And it's a mirrorless, slightly better 80D. But this camera came out over 2.5 years ago, and at that time it wasn't cutting edge. I mean, 1080-60 was just the norm. So I really hate to say this, but I think Canon's release of this mirrorless camera fully shows that it's kind of bowing down to Sony. So this was my first 4K camera. It's the Sony RX10 Mark II, and at the time the specs were so amazing it was almost unbelievable. So I purchased this camera before my 80D 70 Mark II and 1DX Mark II. So you can definitely tell after this guy, I kind of jumped ship from Sony. And it really came down to 4 reasons, which is why up until this point, I have not switched back to Sony. First off, battery life. These guys are super small, they don't hold a lot, and as you probably know, mirrorless cameras use a ton more battery because they constantly have to display either the back screen or the viewfinder. My batteries here weren't even lasting like an hour of shooting, and they were super inconsistent sometimes. They would last a couple hours, other times half an hour. I just couldn't rely on these batteries at all. Speaking of which, Canon has always had fantastic battery life. I've never had a single problem. Like, I don't think I've actually ran out of power in a camera in the last 2 years. I do have quite a few spare LPE6 batteries that I often bring along, but I usually only need to use one battery for an entire day of shooting. Now I'd like to hear a Sony user say something like that. I do believe Sony may have released a new battery that is supposed to last longer. I haven't heard much about that, but they might be working towards a solution on that. The second reason is the color science of Sony sensors. Now you've probably heard a ton of people talking about that. I personally have always loved the look of Canon sensors, basically just out of the camera. These guys look really natural and just the skin tones look amazing, and if you look at a blue sky, it looks exactly like it would in real life. And I found that just straight out of the camera, the colors just don't look quite as natural. I mean, it looks like it's processed a little bit more. So the thing is, if you do a lot of color correction and if you try to push all your colors into funky things, if you do a lot of like LUT work, which I've gotten into a little bit, you can deal with that because you're already manipulating the footage quite a bit. But for a lot of stuff that I do, I like to make it look as natural as possible, and I also try to spend as minimal time in the editing room. And that just means if you can get it looking great straight out of the camera, that's gonna go a long ways. The third reason why I had switched over to Canon was at the time, Sony didn't have a lot of great lenses, and their really high-end things were super expensive, more expensive than the Canon L series lenses. Now since then, Sony has made a lot of really great video lenses. I haven't used them as much, but from what I've seen, I don't think there's that big of a difference that I would want to sell all of my Canon lenses to buy a bunch of new Sony lenses. For me right now, and I know a lot of DSLR video shooters out there, we all have a ton of investment in Canon glass and cameras and everything in the Canon ecosystem. So to switch over to Sony is a really big deal. For the past 2 years, I've seen Canon fall behind the competition, mainly being Sony, just slowly enough that it wasn't a super big deal because I was still getting fantastic footage out of my DSLR cameras. But now that they've released basically a competitor to what Sony is doing, and specs wise, it is just 3 or 4 years behind where they should be. That's making me reconsider. My final downside of Sony cameras is they just don't feel very ergonomically good to hold in the hands. The design of basically every compact Sony camera they have ever made is very similar to this. I'm not exactly sure what this material is, but it's very sharp, it's nice and lightweight, but it feels like I could drop this or it could get damaged very easily. And even if you hear the front lens barrel of this guy, take a listen. Let me take off the lens hood. I don't know about you guys, but that does not sound super secure. So on that point, if you're shooting any kind of event or if you're outside a lot and you just need a camera that's really well built, every single Canon camera that I've ever held just feels like you're not gonna drop it. I oftentimes hold my 1DX if I'm out shooting. I don't even have a camera strap. I'm just holding it like this. That's how much I trust the ergonomics of Canon cameras. So as I've said, I really don't want to switch out of Canon because I have so much invested here and I love just basically everything about these cameras. But with this latest release and actually the lack of releases we've seen in the past couple of years here, it's kind of making me think maybe there are better options out there. So those are my thoughts on the EOS R. I was really hoping for a mirrorless camera that would work with all my Canon lenses and just basically be a 1DX that's a mirrorless version, but that's not what we got. I'm not really sure why Canon is doing this. I'm sure they have the ability, the technology to do mirrorless stuff like they do with their DSLRs because Sony has been doing that for a super long time now. So I don't understand like what the roadblock is. Who knows? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the EOS R if you're thinking about buying one, which I don't think a single person on the planet is planning to buy an EOS R. But if you are, I'd love to hear your comments. And if anybody has some suggestions for some good lenses for the A7R III, I'd love to hear those as well. Thank you for watching, and as always, don't forget to keep it pro.